In a monumental victory today, News UK have admitted that The Sun, the flagship title for Rupert Murdoch's UK media empire, has indeed engaged in illegal practices. This represents a vindication for the hundreds of other claimants who were strong-armed into settling without being able to get to the truth of what was done to them.
The words of Prince Harry's barrister, David Sherborne, outside the High Court, after Prince Harry settled his legal case with the publisher of the Sun newspaper over claims of unlawful intrusion into his life. Rupert Murdoch's news group Newspapers, NGN, agreed to pay substantial damages and apologise to the Duke of Sussex for serious intrusion by the Sun between 1996 and 2011, admitting incidents of unlawful activity were carried out by private investigators working for the newspaper. But it was the offer of an unequivocal apology which has been seen as a major turning point in the fight to hold journalists and media organisations accountable for their actions.
After endless resistance, denials and legal battles by newsgroup newspapers, including spending more than £1 billion in payouts and in legal costs, as well as paying off those in the know, in order to prevent the full picture from coming out, News UK is finally held to account for its illegal actions and its blatant disregard for the law.
For this week's Convex Conversation with me, broadcaster Helen Fospero, I'm joined by one of the board members of Hacked Off, Emma Jones. Hacked Off was established in 2011 in response to phone hacking revelations and actively supported by Hugh Grant, who also recently settled a privacy claim against NGN. The actor accused The Sun of using private investigators to tap his phone and burgle his house, and is now calling for the Crown Prosecution Service and the Metropolitan Police to investigate the newspaper's owners. Emma is a journalist and author. She's worked on national newspaper titles, including The Sun, is a former editor of Smash Hits, and has been at the heart of Hacked Off's campaign for a free and accountable press. Emma, thank you so much for being here. It's very lovely to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Before we explore the recent settlements and implications, tell me a bit about Hacked Off, what it's all about and why it was set up.
Hacked Off was set up in response to the phone hacking revelations, as you rightly said. At the time, it was a collective of a few people basically getting together who were outraged about what was happening. And as these revelations came out, we realised that there were more and more victims of the press and so much work to do. And it's really just continued from there. We work closely with victims of the press and people who, without Hacked Off, wouldn't really have any recourse, wouldn't have anywhere to go, because the press complaints handling situation at the moment is diabolical. So essentially, we try and at least support people and point them in the right direction and are a place to go when something like that's happened to you, often for no reason other than you've been caught up in a news event.
What drew you originally, Emma, to Hacked Off?
Well, in my case, I was a journalist working for many years on the tabloid papers when I was young. I stepped away from that about 20 years ago now, but kept a close eye on things. And certainly when the phone hacking stuff came out and the Leveson inquiry happened, I was absolutely transfixed because I knew what had been going on, or what the seeds of what were beginning to happen in newsrooms, and obviously a lot of the people who were involved as well. So from that point of view, it was interesting. Also, from a personal perspective, my partner was a whistleblower. He worked on the Sunday Mirror newspaper and was one of the only people who came out and said, I was asked to hack a phone. He subsequently walked away from his job as a result of this. And so obviously it had a close personal connection to me as well. So that was in 2014 that happened.
When you said you saw the seeds of what then happened, what kind of things were you noticing in the industry at that time?
I think what happened in the industry in the late 90s and following on from that was more of a concentration on celebrity-focused stories and easy wins, I suppose. And there was more and more use of private investigators in the newsroom. It was a norm, I think.
Was it really a norm?
It was a norm, I would say. In fact, it was sort of a badge of honour to have a private investigator and to be able to say, I've got such and such's number, I can give you my private investigator. And they were used often for illegal practices as well, but for things like information to be gathered quickly. So things were getting more and more sophisticated. I was not involved in anything like phone hacking, but I was beginning to see how that could develop in a few years' time. And I think that's possibly what happened. And I think certain people got caught up in that and it just spiraled out of all control.
How important is it, Emma, that we continue to fight for a free and a transparent press?
I think in this day and age, it couldn't be more vital to fight for a free and transparent press, because we're bombarded with information and we need reliable information in order to inform our politics and inform our public life. It's a vital part of our democracy. And I think what you have to get is the balance right between commercial interests of a newspaper, relationships between newspapers and politicians, and also, more importantly, the service that they can do for the public. And I think most journalists, most reporters and most people involved in newspapers are passionate about that last bit, informing the public, doing interesting stories, engaging people, keeping people informed. But I think what had happened in previous years is those other components had become mismanaged and unbalanced. And we see how critically important it is that that doesn't happen, because in the end, that can lead to corruption and it can lead to criminality.
The case with Prince Harry has taken years and years to settle. You've been in court for many key moments. It's been quite a journey for all of you at Hacked Off, hasn't it?
Yes, I mean, while Hacked Off aren't directly involved in Prince Harry's legal case, it's been fascinating to watch this one individual take on the press. In fact, it kind of took this individual, this specific, unique kind of individual, to do that. And you almost couldn't make up the story. It's so good, because you needed a royal prince with the tenacity, the stories behind him, this particular relationship he'd had with the papers growing up, and also the money, of course, to fight that. And I think the bravery too. I think hats off to Harry, whatever people think of him. These are fierce people to go up against.
Harry's been fighting for a long time. Just remind us, Emma, of the kind of intrusion that he was not only upset about, but also incensed about.
Well, of course, we won't know exactly what he was talking about, because that won't be heard in court now, having settled with NGN. But I believe we're talking about things like his medical records being accessed. We're talking about blagging, UIGs, the use of unlawful information, which in some ways is even worse than phone hacking. They basically employing people to find out every kind of information, tracking cars, all kinds of things. We've talked to PIs across the world who've worked for newspapers, and some of the things that they admitted to doing and were prepared to testify to were mind-boggling.
And there was an admission of unlawful activities. Was that things like phone hacking then that the newspaper group have admitted to in his settlement and apology?
Yes, it's access to documents. It's things like, I was saying, medical information. It's blagging. It's having people on the phone pretending to be that person in order to find out information. And that went on in Harry's case from when he was a young man. So when he was just a teenager. So it was things like information about his girlfriends. He said that these things affected his relationships when he was just forming them with young women. And it's the sort of thing that would be everybody's worst nightmare. But yeah, we're talking about unlawful information gathering, essentially.
And we're also talking about his mum, aren't we? I mean, Princess Diana was also named in the settlement and the apology.
I think that Harry drew a few lines in the sand, and that was one of them, that he wanted acknowledgement that this was a fight that he'd taken on because of what happened to his mother. We all know his mum was chased in a car by photographers and paparazzi desperate for information and stories about her to fill the newspapers. So in his mind, she was chased to her death by the press. Whether people fully agree with that or not, it doesn't really matter. I think it's been the passionate campaign for that reason. And I think that he feels standing up to the press is something that he's doing because it's a point of principle.
His barrister, David Sherborne, such an eloquent speaker. I was captivated by his speech outside of the court. He referred to this as a monumental victory. I'm told that it was quite an emotional moment for the legal team and the claimants, and possibly as well for members of your campaign group when all of that happened. Can you tell me a bit about that, Emma?
Well, it was very exciting in court. The first day that we arrived in court, we were expecting the case just to open, but there was a different atmosphere. It was a case of the two sides were beginning to talk to each other and you could see something was happening. And then, I don't know if you know, but the first day in court was adjourned and then it was adjourned again. And then in the end, the legal team asked for more time. The judge refused and they had to take it elsewhere in order to ask for an overnight stay. So it was tense and exciting stuff. The judge was unhappy and he looked very angry about it all. The next day we had a resolution, but it was just 2 minutes after David Sherborne, Harry's lawyer, was supposed to start the opening. People were turning around in court thinking, well, where is he? And I think at one point the judge turned to his junior and said, are you going to be leading today? And Julian Santos looked as if to say, I hope not, but I can. Anyway, that's how close to the wire it went. Of course, Harry was in California. He would have been there for the case had it have gone ahead 2 weeks later, I think. But he was negotiating from California. And with the time difference, it meant that those lawyers had been up all night trying to hammer out the fine details of what that apology might look like.
When you realised that it was going to be a settlement, was there an initial disappointment? Because did you know at that stage that he'd negotiated a settlement with an apology, which for me, I think is the key bit which makes this such a monumental victory. So did you know at that point, or did you think it was feeling like it was just going to be a settlement?
Oh, I think we knew it was going to be a pretty monumental thing because he wasn't going to just settle without that apology. And I think the specifics of that were always going to be interesting. So whilst there's a small part of me and I think the rest of the team that would have liked to have seen all those things tested in court, I also think that this is a really big step forward on both sides, actually, because this is the first time NGN have ever admitted this. To use that word unlawful activity was huge for them. And I know that that went right to the wire. And I think that the negotiations on that specific wording were very, very difficult to come to.
Were you standing outside when David Sherborne made that address?
Yes, and I think actually David went further than the apology and than anyone expected. I'm pretty sure that people at NGM will have been slightly unnerved by the fact that he did go so far in what he said afterwards outside court, and it was stirring stuff. There was silence from everyone, including the press pack, who were quite stunned really at that moment. But it was a real moment of triumph, I think. You've got to remember the civil court isn't really the right place to try these sorts of things. It should have taken place. All of these things would have been unearthed, we hoped, had Leveson Part 2 gone ahead, which was the second part of the public inquiry, which was supposed to look at things like the relationships between politicians, police and the press. And of course, that was cancelled by the Conservative government. I think it was in 2018 by Matt Hancock, who was then the Secretary of State. So it was something that was always going to be quite tricky had it have been in court. You're never quite sure what's going to come out, and it's a long and arduous process. So I think that this really is a considerable feather in Harry's cap.
I noticed that there was a lot of TV and radio coverage, but not that much in the papers. And the slant was quite different, i.e. Harry settled, and it didn't seem to be quite the victory that perhaps some of us, hands up, I'm newspaper journalists too, and I felt it was a monumental victory. Did you notice that difference between the TV and the newspaper coverage?
Well, I was anticipating that would happen because it is largely ignored. This is the one story that the newspapers don't want to talk about, which of course is ironic. This is Murdoch's empire who keep this sort of information from the public. So is it surprising that a lot of newspapers followed suit and were too frightened perhaps to talk about this? It's an industry that just doesn't point the mirror back at itself. It's not prepared to self-reflect, or hasn't been in the past. But I'm hopeful that that's changing. I think the Independent newspaper had a front cover which was completely accurate and 2 more pages on the inside and a column about this. So there are some newspapers out there that were prepared to grasp this and talk about it. But I think the broadcast journalism actually around this was pretty staggering. I wasn't expecting them to go so big and for it to be so well reported and well understood as well by the public, because I think people did understand that it wasn't just a score draw.
Just explain what lengths NGN have gone to in terms of settling and paying out to avoid all of this being analysed either in a civil case or indeed a criminal prosecution.
Well, for every Prince Harry, there's thousands of people who've settled out of court because they haven't got the power and they can't afford to take on the risk to go to court to fight these things. And Murdoch has spent an awful lot of money settling those cases out of court. I think the number was something like 32,000 people. It's a huge amount of people. So mostly the plan had been keep this out of the public eye and settle. But in this case, Harry just kept fighting and taking it as far as he could. But the way that these sorts of cases operate, it's very difficult because the financial risk is so huge for that person.
Just explain why the financial risk is so huge, because we'll talk about Hugh Grant's case in a minute. He settled recently. And for a movie star like Hugh to also bow out on the grounds of this could cost me millions. Just explain it's kind of a flaw in the civil case, isn't it, in terms of why it's difficult for a claimant to go full on in.
Well, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, but I believe that the system's set up so that if you're offered a settlement that is more than you would receive in court, should that be resolved, even if you win, you would have to pay the other side's costs. So I think the motivation behind the system is to make people resolve their differences before they get to the courtroom. So that's why it's set up in the way it is. But it means that you can't have these fights. You can't have all this brought out into the open because the hundreds of thousands of pounds that you might face, the costs for the other side would be phenomenal. And you just don't know what that will be at that point. So it's too much of a risk, even if you're a film star. It goes to show just how much money we're talking about.
Hugh Grant said on Radio 4 that both his own case and that of Prince Harry have shown a civil case is not the right instrument to get the real truth. That's like you were saying there, just Emma, of what happened at the paper. And he's called for the police to open a new criminal investigation into the owners of the Sun, saying that the job isn't done by any measure. We've got a clip of him speaking on BBC Radio 4's Today programme following Prince Harry's settlement and the apology from NGN.
For me and Prince Harry, we both were trying to use a civil trial to get at the real truth. A civil case against a newspaper is not the right instrument for that, as has been proven with Prince Harry's case and with mine, because unless you're prepared to spend 10, 20 million pounds, you're not going to get findings in court. They're going to game the system to silence you, and that's what they've done consistently over the last 10 years. They've spent £1 billion to make sure that these things are never looked at in court. I think what they're terrified of is that those findings would trigger a new criminal inquiry.
So is Hugh right, Emma? Are NGN terrified that the findings of a proper judicial case would possibly trigger a criminal inquiry?
Well, I think so. I think that they wouldn't be settling if they didn't think so themselves. I'm sure they will want this put behind them. And there's no doubt that some of the witnesses that were going to be called from the other side would have had some considerably damaging information that would have put the senior leadership team or the executives at that place at risk. So it was obviously in their interest to try and settle this. The costs, we don't know the exact numbers, but they are staggering. But I know with Hugh, for example, he definitely didn't want to settle. He was passionately, vehemently, he wanted to go to the end. He wanted to have his day in court and he wanted to talk about the things that had happened to him. He believed that his house had been burgled. He had information about all kinds of terrible personal intrusions that he wanted to be brought out into the open. So it's unfortunate in a sense, but I think I agree with Hugh. It's not the correct instrument really to do that. As for a criminal investigation, in the past, the police have looked into this. I think there's pressure on them now mounting for them to continue to do that and to reopen an investigation. But whether or not that will happen remains to be seen. But certainly at the moment, there's a lot of information going in direction. And I think Tom Watson's talked about a dossier of information going to the police as well, which may well trigger that.
Tom's former deputy Labour leader, and he did recently also reach a settlement with NGN and talked about his legal team passing on this dossier to the Met Police. The Met Police have said that there's no active investigations into the allegations of phone hacking or related matters. But what's the next step other than Tom Watson's dossier? Does Hacked Off have a role in this? Can you put things forward to the police and push and press for an investigation?
I think what Hacked Off's role is to lobby the government as well and say this is unfinished business. This has been going on for a long time now. We're talking almost 2 decades, I think. So it's unfinished business. And had it been the post office or any other public body or something that affects public life, the newspapers would have been all over it. It's something that I think people still feel needs to be adequately addressed, and justice needs to be brought for people who have had their lives intruded and illegal practices used against them for no other reason than they've been caught up in a news story. We're really on the side of those just ordinary victims of the press, people who have had their lives turned upside down, but obviously they don't have the same status and the same voice as people in the public eye do. And that's why it's helpful that we can rely on people who are prepared to raise their head above the parapet and talk about this issue, because there aren't that many people who will. And the papers would always say, this is just celebrities moaning about the fact that they don't like their private lives being investigated because they're all up to no good. But it's more than that. It takes an awful lot of bravery. It's much easier as somebody in the public eye to just say, I'm just going to do a deal with the papers and I'm not really going to talk about this, and I'm going to get a nice easy ride, and nobody's going to say horrible things about me or horrible things about my wife or any of the rest of it, and I'm just going to take the money and go. So I would say that those people who are in the public eye, who do put their hand up and speak out for those victims of the press who can't, I'd say they're pretty amazing people, actually, because they don't have to do that, and I don't think most people would.
And I think it would have been very easy. I think Hugh was very brave. And I think the fact that you say he wanted his day in court, that's really brave too, because a lot of things are aired that perhaps you don't want aired in public. But he was willing to do it, wasn't he?
He was totally willing to do it. He was devastated that he couldn't. I think his statement when he did settle was really from the heart. He was furious, I think, in a sense that he couldn't fight that in court. But of course, nobody really wants to stand in court because you don't quite know the flavour of the day. You don't know which way the judge is going to go. It's a tricky, difficult place to navigate for anybody. Even for somebody like Hugh Grant, obviously financially secure, but had he have had his day in court, he could have been liable, they say, for up to £10 million. It depends what the other side have settled, and we're talking about enormous amounts of money.
Even if he'd won, that's even if he'd won, isn't it?
So if you win and the other side have already offered you a certain amount of money, which exceeds that money that you would have if you won, it means that you have to pay their side and you have to pay their costs. So it's just a horrible kind of risky situation. And it's taken somebody with the royal purse to actually be able to take that on, because nobody actually has that kind of money in actual fact. Nobody with children and with a home and even with good job security wants to take on that kind of financial risk. You can understand it. So it's just something that if you're an ordinary member of the public is completely out of reach.
And Hugh's been passionate about Hacked Off since it began, hasn't he? He was one of the original team.
Yeah, this is the thing that really drives him as a human being, I think, his involvement with Hacked Off. And he's been there since the beginning, since it was found out that schoolgirl Millie Dowler's phone was hacked all those years ago. And he's fought this campaign ever since and is as involved as everyone else and has turned up at some very rough and ready places to drink tea with the campaign and to talk to people and talk to ordinary victims. And he takes time out all the time to make sure that he's engaged and understands what's going on and has made some really good friends, I think, through the campaign. I think he feels that it's a part of his life, which I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think it keeps him quite grounded, that he understands that this is the other side of the coin, in a sense.
One thing I didn't realise until you just said it, was how many ordinary victims there are of this. I suppose I've seen the headlines and people like Sienna Miller settle and David Tennant and lots of big celebrity names having their phone hacked, or the journalists using really intrusive measures to get a good headline. But ordinary people have been affected too, lots of them.
Well, yes, the problem is the prism through which people see this story is when you see the Sienna Millers on the news accepting damages outside court. And I think it can be quite hard for the public to have sympathy with that. But behind that, there's so many people that we work with who've had absolutely horrific stories of press intrusion and their lives intruded at the most awful points of their life. One of the board members on Hacked Off, Mandy Garner, her daughter was sadly killed in a hit-and-run accident, and the Daily Mail obtained footage of the moment before she stepped into the road from the shopkeepers who had CCTV cameras just outside, and they put that online before she'd even had chance to even mention it to certain members of her family. And obviously, in her mind, as she said to me, that's the moment that she relives again and again and again. She would have tried to stop her daughter stepping out into that road at that moment. It's incredibly intrusive, and she fought a long battle with IPSO to try and get remedy, and ultimately found the system of redress to be completely ineffective and useless. Since IPSO's foundation after the Leveson inquiry part 1, there have been no fines, no investigations. And I know thousands of people who've tried to use that process as a mechanism to try and get some sort of redress and just found it to be confusing, wieldy, deliberately time-consuming, and have had no justice at the end of it. So that's really what Hacked Off is about. It's about fighting for people like Mandy and lots of other people. We work with people whose children were sadly killed in the Manchester bombings. If you remember the Ariana Grande concert where there was a bombing, and sadly a lot of young people were caught up in that. And some of the press intrusion around that was absolutely devastating. And we work with families like that as well, who were told the news of their children's death by newspaper reporters before they even knew themselves. I think that there is space, though, for reflection from newspapers. And I think that moments like Harry's moment in court, and actually the moments between those two legal sides, I do think there is a sense that some reflection can take place and that things can change. And I really passionately believe that would be good for public life for everybody. And I think most people who work in newspapers would agree with me.
Oh, I'm sure they would. I wonder as well whether there is reflection at NGN. And yes, they've paid off, I think it's more than $1 billion in settlements. But one would hope now, and having done the apology to Prince Harry, that things have changed in newsrooms and people do think twice about the intrusion that goes on. Do you think there will be different practices at NGN?
I think after this and after a period of reflection, and already to a certain extent, I think that people at NGN and those senior executive positions will be looking to do things differently in the future. And I really welcome that. And I think that that could be a really wonderful thing, because if you've got a newspaper group like that leading the charge on something so monumentally important for the public, it would be a great thing. And I think other newspapers would follow suit. That's me being hopeful. So I don't know.
It's heartbreaking to hear you talk about the stories that even I, as a journalist, get distracted because it's the big celebrities that get the big headlines on these stories. But I'm a reporter through and through and have been since I was 17. And to hear of that kind of intrusion and finding out your loved ones died before you even know from a clip or something online or a newspaper is really horrific. And I would imagine that Hacked Off's still got an awful lot of work to do.
Well, it is. And I'm a reporter through and through as well. And I know that actually with some concentration and with the right support in newsrooms and a serious look at these things, a lot of those things could be avoided as well. We all know how passionate you can get on stories and how you want to get the story. And it can be a moment when reflection doesn't always come into it. But I think if newsrooms put one foot into the future, like a lot of other industries have now. I think times have changed a lot, but I think maybe the old Fleet Street, which doesn't even exist in Fleet Street, failed to do that. I was lucky when I left newspapers in that I got involved in my children's school. I worked for a charity. I understood how different places work, and it opened my eyes to see that actually it doesn't have to be like that. And we could change cultural practices in newspapers from the newsroom up. And I think that that would actually change the way news gathering worked. And actually we could have less of this sort of thing. And with also responsible news gathering, we could have some sort of sense whereby there would be redress and there would be an effective regulator. I think that would work wonders to make sure that everybody was singing from the same hymn sheet and these terrible intrusions and terrible invasions of privacy didn't happen.
You worked as a columnist for The Sun, you're a reporter on papers like the Sunday Mirror, the Mail on Sunday. What was the culture like at that time? I know we touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but were they exciting days for you as a young reporter? Because I remember Fleet Street, for me, held a real fascination, and my short time in newspapers before television, I really enjoyed it.
Oh, yeah. It was what I always wanted to do. I was a local reporter in North Wales, and then I came to London. I think the first day on the Sunday Mirror was when there was a nail bombing. I don't know if you remember the nail bomber. There was a bomb in Brixton and then in Soho as well. And it was a huge story to be involved on your first day. And I just was passionate about the fact that I could be involved and put stuff in the paper about this important event. So it was a wonderful time. It was a really exciting time. But I did see newsrooms change to become more focused on celebrity as well. And I think that that was both good and bad. Commercially, I think it felt like a good idea at the time. But actually, when I first started on newspapers then, they were still putting money in tabloid newspapers into investigations, sending reporters abroad to do stories about child slavery, all sorts of interesting stories. And unfortunately, I think that celebrity culture-driven news finding did take over a little bit. And actually, no surprise that revenues dropped at the same time.
Was there a feeling, even in those days, do you think, right at the top, that they were all powerful and perhaps in some ways above the law?
Oh, newsroom culture is driven by, adrenaline and excitement, and it should be. It's about current events, and it takes particular kinds of people who want to be engaged with that. It's fast-paced and exciting, but things have changed a little bit in terms of news gathering as well. I think there's slower news now. We're bombarded with information. And when I first started in newspapers, we didn't have Google. We had to go and get information as and when. Mobile phones were huge. It was a very different world. So now information gathering is a very different thing. And I think newspapers can probably afford to do slower news and be more considered. And as boring as that sounds, even to me, I think it can be very exciting because it means you can do more in-depth stuff.
I think we were in Fleet Street around that same time and I felt that same buzz and adrenaline. Did you feel, though, that perhaps the jobbing journalists like us sometimes perhaps took a bit more of the heat while those higher up perhaps didn't get involved in that day-to-day stuff?
I think when you're a young reporter, you're eager to please. It's an industry that's set up to make people want to feel like they might lose their job the next day almost. I remember that sort of sense of you've got to get the story, otherwise you're out on your ear. So that was part and parcel of what being a reporter was. But as we saw with the phone hacking scandal, it was the reporters who ended up taking the rap and not the news executives who issued the orders, which was unfair, I thought. And I think I've always been a great believer in people feeling that they have employment rights and that they should be able to feel secure and not bullied at work. And I think there's a balance to be had there between making people eager to go out and get a story. But in certain parts of the press, I think when bullying and executives maybe got a little bit out of hand and started treating people unfairly, that just doesn't need to happen. And I don't believe for one moment that that makes better newspapers or better news or better stories. I think that there's a lot to be learned from other areas We look around us now, the rest of the world has changed an awful lot. You would not have that kind of thing, that kind of bullying in a workplace happen anywhere else. So I'd like to think that that doesn't happen anymore in newspapers, but I don't know. I know there's a lot less people work in newspapers now. So obviously that's going to be a factor that makes it more difficult to hang on to your job. But reporters put themselves at enormous risk, and I think that they should be supported at work, and they should know the limits of their job. They should know what they can and can't do. And I think, again, that boils down to having decent regulation.
And was it difficult for Graham? You mentioned Graham, your partner, at the beginning, and said he turned whistleblower. Did he feel that he just had to come out and say what was happening?
Oh, yeah, it was a very difficult time. We had a young family, and this was something that was just playing on his mind. The stories were coming out all the time about the police were looking into this, and he was just adamant that he should say something. And I think he probably thought that other people would say something too, because it certainly wasn't just him. And in his case, it was not a practice that he used. He was asked by senior executives at the Sunday Mirror to do this, called into the office, shown how to do it, and told for this one particular job, not even a job of any merit, something to do with intruding a celebrity's life because they may or may not have been up to something. A really innocuous, stupid story, not the type of thing that he was usually doing. He was forced into a position where he did that and eventually, as I say, walked off the job. And I think he hoped that that would lead to other people coming forward. And I think he felt compelled to do it. But for our family, it was very difficult because then he was blacklisted and he had to do community service. And it was a really bad time. But I still think he would do the same thing again. It just wasn't what he went into newspapers for. And I don't think it would be for anyone. People who are passionate about being reporters want to be out getting stories like you do, talking to people, finding out interesting stories. And you get interesting stories when you go out into the wider world and you talk to people. What I saw happen in newspapers was people not leaving the office and never stepping foot outside. And that can't be a healthy thing to be when you're supposed to be this outward facing thing, bringing everything that people can't possibly gather in a day in front of them, their eyes, and saying, look, you know, this is what's going on in the world. How can you possibly do that when you're just sitting tapping numbers into a phone in an office?
ITV have announced a new 7-part drama, I think for the autumn, called The Hack, starring David Tennant, who himself accepted damages from Newsgroup newspapers over phone hacking claims. I'm just wondering whether there's any hope that, I know it's a drama, but as we saw very well with the Post Office drama starring Toby Jones, who I noticed is also in The Hack, that helped postmasters and mistresses get their story across and wake the government up to start paying some compensation. Is there any hope that maybe this drama might help people understand the story better and could possibly help down that route of a criminal prosecution?
Well, I haven't seen the drama, but I know all the people involved, including one of the board members, Jackie Hames, who used to present BBC's Crime Watch and had her phone hacked as a consequence.
Did she? I remember Jackie actually from Crime Watch.
Yeah, she's been a passionate campaigner for longer than me on all of this, and her story's covered in this. Obviously, it's a dramatisation, but if it does put the spotlight onto this story, I think that could be a really good thing, actually, in the same way, as you say, as the Post Office drama did. In some ways, I think that's disappointing as well, that it takes a dramatisation for the government to sit up and take notice. But we do know that it's that relationship between politicians and the press and that fear factor that they've always had about not being able to control the media that has led to them cower in the past. So perhaps in this case, rather than cowering, they might say, actually, if we stood up to this and we came out and took a stand and worked towards a better resolution, then we could come out all powerful. I think it just takes one brave government, and I'm quite surprised that there's not been one in the past and that they've all trodden this well-worn path whereby they just do as the papers say.
And of course, there's more to come because there's Prince Harry's case with the Mail pending, isn't there?
Yes, next year Harry is due to take the Mail to court, which is a fair way off, but it's the same thing again. So we will have to wait and see what happens there.
It's early days in America with Donald Trump back in the White House as president. How will the press be feeling right now, do you think, over in the States, Emma?
I think we should take note in this country and look at what's happening in America and look at the way that I just think that we should look at our press in this country and feel proud that we've still got something that we can manage and something that we can rely on. But when you look across to America and what's happening with Donald Trump, I think it's quite scary times. And I think, having said that, they do have fact checkers and they do have newspapers that regularly make sure that they are putting the correct information in front of people, which is something we could learn from.
Some people, I think perhaps it's time to move on from the hacking scandal, that it's old news, the story's been around for perhaps more than a decade. Why is that fight still worth fighting, Emma? And what gets you out of bed in the morning to do your work with Hacked Off?
Well, it's funny, isn't it, that argument, this is in the past, forget about it. I think if you look at any inquiry, any great scandal, it will be in the past. It's bound to be in the past. And it's unfinished business. Justice has not been done. And that's why it's so important to keep fighting until it has been done. Look at things like the Hillsborough inquiry. We wouldn't be saying this about anything else other than newspapers. And remember, that's newspaper rhetoric you're talking about. It's in the past, forget about it. It's only in the past because it hasn't been resolved and justice hasn't been given to those victims of the press who've had no one to stand up to the press. And I think that that's what gets me out of bed in the morning, is thinking of those ordinary people I talk to and trying to make a better place for reporters to work as well, and people who are passionate about newspapers like me, because I think the free press is vitally important. And I'll borrow that line from the press as much as I like, because my interpretation of it is responsible news, regulated news, news that serves the people rather than intrudes into their private lives.
That's a very powerful way to end our podcast. Thank you so much for taking time to come, Emma. This is such a huge subject. It's a really important subject. And I think you've very eloquently explained some of what's gone on behind the scenes and interpreted some of the news that we've seen over the last couple of weeks. So many thanks to you.
Thanks for having me. And it's nice to talk to another passionate reporter who we're able to talk about this in a rational way without taking a very black and white view.
No, I'm sure over a glass of wine we probably have lots of people we know and probably ended up on a lot of the same stories at one point. But it's been so nice to meet you. Thank you so much. You've been listening to journalist and author Emma Jones, a board director of campaign group Hacked Off, talking about Prince Harry's recent settlement, an apology from News Group newspapers for intrusion into his private life, and what the next steps might look like. Download our series at convex.podbean.com or search The Convex Conversation on Spotify or wherever you listen to yours. I'll be back next week with music legend Malcolm Geary, who's worked with Madonna, U2, Stevie Wonder and many, many more huge names, produced the BAFTAs for 23 years, and we'll also be talking about a new film he's just finished making with blind tenor Andrea Bocelli. Join me then.